So for this week's discussion, I don't really have slides here because these are just kind of independent articles that you're reading. And so the theme for this week's readings are all about this concept known as the triple bottom line. And so the first article, and again, I'm going to presume that you can read here. You don't need me to read for you. But this chapter was written about 20 some years ago. And it was written by John Elkington, who was actually the founder, the creator of the term the triple bottom line. So it's a nice first person perspective. And to kind of understand what he was trying to do was he was trying to think about, there was this idea that um, there were a great deal of both social and environmental problems in the 1980s and early 1990s that were kind of rising to the top, right? And the problem, the challenge that was faced, that John was kind of thinking of is how do you get businesses to care about these kinds of things, right? How do you get the business to care about social problems or to care about environmental problems? And I mean, it's a pretty ingenious idea. Basically, when we think of a business, what do they care about? They care about profits, right? They care about the bottom line. What is the bottom line? That would be, right, their measure of profit or loss, their difference between their revenue and their costs. So all that Elkington then says is, well, what if we change it? What if we change the conversation so that it's not just about profit in the accounting bottom line, but we make it a triple bottom line where we basically look at um, people, planet, and profits, right? The profits part's a little bit easier to understand. Again, the accountants would help us with that. But then this kind of 3P formulation would be the other part of this would be the people and the planet, right? And you look at this term here, and it's actually pretty interesting. He did this kind of like search term. Look at that. All these kind of different terms being used as the 90s came to a close. And then triple bottom line really takes off, right? Really takes off and it becomes now, it is today the dominant way in which we talk about integrating into the business world this idea of businesses caring about these things. Another way to think, though, about the triple bottom line would be to think about things in terms of this being a form of sustainable capitalism. And in sustainable capitalism, what we're talking about is this idea that, if the environment becomes destroyed or if the social structure becomes destroyed, then there's no way that capitalism is going to be able to exist. So in order to make capitalism sustainable, you need that steadiness, you need that consistency in the environment and in society. And so in terms of that sustainability, Elkington looked at this from 7 perspectives, where he had 7 different drivers of where this all existed. I'll let you look at this part here. I'm not going to expand on that too much here. But what it does for us is it gets us to a point today where if we were to look in a corporate boardroom, that it looks very different than it did 25 years ago, in part because of this idea of the triple bottom line. That you could have things like a chief diversity officer, right? Or you could have someone who's an officer in terms of the environment and just general sustainability. Um, it the corporation then isn't doing it just out of benevolence. Rather, the business is doing it because it's concerned that if it doesn't incorporate social and environmental stability into its larger structure, that the business itself will fail to be able to exist. This all happens again at the turn of the 21st century. Now, we don't get there just with Elkington coming out of this, right? And we've kind of seen these kinds of waves happening here, right? We talked about this when we talked about different ways that we'd have a regulatory framework. That is, early as the 1970s, when we would talk about the environment and even just kind of social unrest, well, that would just be a nature for something for lawyers and PR people to kind of talk about, right? But then you'll notice here, and this is Elkington's description, is that as we get into the 1980s, the conversation itself starts to expand, where the business starts to have a little bit more of a realization that this could matter to them. Now, it obviously matters a lot more clearly if I'm like an oil company, right? And obviously, environmental sustainability is a part and parcel of my business. But why would environmental sustainability matter for a prison, for instance? Well, that would be, where you start to think about things in terms of like planning and projects, right? Like, where am I going to put a prison? Or why should I not put a prison next to the ocean if water levels are rising? That kind of thing. But it's in the 1990s when there's just a broader acceptance of this idea that the environment and social stability matters and that it's an integral part of the business. And that's what we get here in wave three. And wave three is what we're kind of living in right now, right? And we kind of see this way that we've progressed over the past 50 some years between waves one and wave three. That during wave one, just having government regulations was not enough. That wasn't enough to really get us through understanding how things ought to be. And that was all about limits, about having regulations for things. It's when we get to wave two, right? And we get these green ideas, talking about the rainforest being destroyed, where we have this general, we even get like the very first Earth Day and stuff in the 1990s, where we're just kind of just becoming more aware, right? We're not really meaningfully changing things, but it's that awareness that kind of sparks things and gets us to the third wave. Again, the wave that we're currently existing in, where we have this course in it right now, right? I mean, it becomes just more kind of an accepted part of the process of being an educated person. What I really liked about this article, in reading this article, is that he sets up a really interesting idea that despite this idea that we could have companies exist in this with this recognition of a triple bottom line, they're not always going to do this. And so what he does is he talks about this idea that things are changing, right? We've got this kind of chrysalis where there's this process of transition, that we've got wealth being created, we've got the environment and social problems kind of emerging. How do we understand all these changes as existing? And what kind of companies are going to exist? He creates 4 different kinds of corporate entities that could exist. Degenerative, which basically are not going to are going to hurt sustainability, and regenerative, those that support sustainability. And whether they have high impact or low impact depends on their locus, where they're seen as having some degree of influence. Locus being the worst. Locust would be one that have a very broad impact, but have a business model that's basically only caring about the levels of profit or loss and not really supporting anything else regenerative in the economy as a whole, right? Not sustainable at all. Then you would have the caterpillar. The caterpillar would be destructive, but it's more destructive on a local level, right? Like a local sawmill or something along those lines. And then in terms of the regenerative, right, we could have the butterflies. These would be like, I don't know, like a farmer's market or things like this where, they're just generally a little bit more localized, as opposed to the honeybees, where the honeybees have a very broad reach. They have very strong partnerships that support a much larger goal and really lead to this greater deal of global change. I like this example because what this means is that, a company can start to strategize, form corporate plans based on where they see themselves in this matrix and where they want to be, right? And then you could think about designing everything else in your firm around this idea of, if we're going to be a locus, then we have to have a particular kind of marketing strategy that's very different than if we're a honeybee, right? It's not just enough to say that we support sustainability or not, because all that does is change the row, not necessarily the column. And it's actually the row and the column that matter here. Um, Again, this is a really easy read, so I'd encourage you to read it, then have an even broader idea of like what's going on, especially from someone like Elkington, who again devised the field as a whole. And so I took this original article, which again is a little over 21 years old, and I transitioned that to something a bit more recent. And that was the Maria Correa piece on kind of updating our general understanding of the literature in sustainability. And and this is coming from, um, you know, from a perspective of how do I understand from a business perspective what's going on? And again, talking about this broader idea of sustainability across the environment, economics, and social sustainability. And, when we think about the entire triple bottom line literature, this is all about why is it in an organization's best interest to integrate these notions of sustainability into their overall processes, into their overall strategies, into their overall framework. And what's nice is we contrast then the Elkington piece to the Correa piece, this current piece, is that if we look at all the things that have happened since then, we've got the Kyoto Protocol, we have obviously the Paris Agreement that I keep talking about from 2015, right, which kind of have this general idea again of, climate change is happening, right? And then we add on to that more recent discussions of the idea that we have, a global population that exceeds 8 billion. And so how do, right, what kind of social disorder comes from that kind of thing? And so we need to put those all together. How do we have a capitalist structure that exists with those challenges? How do what sustainability looks like today in 2025, what I'm arguing, is very different than what sustainability looked like in the 1980s and the 1970s. And, what we can see, and this is another way of kind of appreciating what it means to care about the triple bottom line, is that even in the Elkington piece, that the triple bottom line, if you're familiar with these Venn diagrams here, that would be where, again, we have all these intersections. So it would be this kind of region, this region, this region. And the most important part would be this little portion right here, where all three are blending together. Now, this is a convenient framework, but one of the small problem that exists here is that even if a company cares about these things, we don't always know that it's going, it doesn't always reflect the reality of the situation, where typically what happens is that one of these dimensions becomes more important than another. And you see this, right, depending on what a person's perspective is, right? Especially if we leave this up to businesses, they're going to put the economy, right, kind of as the foundation here, right? That everything else kind of matters from that. But if we look at this from an overlapping sphere, right, what that starts to do is it starts to prioritize certain segments over the other. Right? If we take this from like a nesting doll kind of perspective, which is kind of one of the perspectives we could take here, in that nesting doll kind of perspective, what we would see is that, well, here, the environment seems to be driving a great deal of the rest of the of society and the economy. It's only when you peel those back, right, that you get to society um, and the economy. Um, and then the challenge again, and we've talked about this in chapters 23 and 24. The challenge with all this is how do you measure it? And there was this really important line in the article, which I'd like to highlight for all of you right here. From an accountability perspective, what is not measurable is not manageable. That's a really important line right there, because what that seems to suggest is how important, well, basically chapters 23 and 24 are. If you cannot measure it, how can you manage it? How can you know that the way that you're acting is efficient or not? You wouldn't. And so that's why it's so complicated, but yet so important to measure the value of clean air, clean water, and just of a human life in general. And it gives us a new way to value the performance of a business and the kind of footprint that it's having. What's useful in this article, and another reason why I picked this article, is that the bibliography for this article is comprehensive. And so if you're finding, especially as you're working on the project, that you're interested in this idea of the triple bottom line and you're just looking for more information, the bibliography in this article could probably set you out on the right direction.